Right now, a jury must decide whether the mother who killed her baby in a microwave oven will live or die.
Angela had a deep-seated need to dominate, control, and abuse.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
No.
Many say motherhood is one of the most beautiful times in someone's life. From time to time, it can also get a little stressful, but it should never get so stressful that it leads to the most unthinkable act a parent can commit: murder. Today, we look at the case of China Arnold, the alcoholic mother with several convictions to her name. After a heavy night of drinking, she got into an argument with her boyfriend and killed her own baby in a microwave oven. Then we have the distressed 911 call that led the police to the body of Angela McAnultys' 15-year-old daughter, who was murdered in a house with its very own torture room. Could the authorities have done something to prevent this death? And finally, we have the case of Louise Porton, a mother who committed the most evil act possible. She took the lives of both of her daughters, 17 days apart, and all because they got in the way of her sex life.
Right now, a jury must decide whether the mother who killed her baby in a microwave oven will live or die.
Just before rush hour on August 30th, 2005, Ohio, a couple arrived in a panic at a medical center. China Arnold had brought her 28-day-old daughter into the emergency room with the help of her boyfriend and the child's father, Terrell Talley. Paris Talley was showing no signs of life, but had a body temperature of 95 degrees. Desperate, doctors and nurses tried for over 15 minutes to revive this fragile young child, but it was already too late. She was declared dead. Her mother claimed that she had gotten home around 2 a.m. that night and had tried to feed Paris, but the child was not able to hold down the food. She also claimed that Paris felt warm, and so she placed her near a fan to try and cool her body temperature. By morning, Paris had shown no signs of improvement, so these worried parents brought her to the medical center in the hope that her daughter could be helped. Sadly, this child was beyond any kind of help any doctor could provide. This would have been the end of the case had it not been for the smarts of the very medical team that her. You see, these professionals knew that something was horribly wrong about this whole situation, as there appeared to be some unusual injuries that they needed to investigate.
Just yelling out that her baby was not burned, that her skin was peeling off.
Burns are an injury many doctors and nurses see often, but there was something different about the burns on Paris's body that nobody could pinpoint. They didn't resemble the kind of burns commonly found. In fact, they were downright weird. They also noticed the baby's clothing wasn't soiled from any kind of bodily fluids. Naturally, it didn't take long before the police became involved. This is where the story given by her parents begins to fall apart. China claimed that she fell asleep with the baby resting on her, to wake up with Paris nowhere in sight. She said she thought Terrell had put the baby to bed, so wasn't immediately concerned. But Terrell had a slightly different version of events that must have left detectives with a very suspicious feeling. He claimed to have come home at around 3 a.m. that fateful night to find his girlfriend and child asleep on the couch where he decided to join them. It was when he woke up that he realized Paris was dead. The coroner was unable to identify the strange burn marks on Paris's body. Although police knew there was something off about the story these parents were giving, they had no evidence of murder, so the pair was released. Shortly after this, China and Terrell moved home, hoping that would be the end of their nightmare and the start of a new chapter in their life. However, they left one vital piece of evidence at the house that would soon be uncovered. Were it not for a news story that made the headlines the following year, it's quite possible this couple could have walked away from murder with no consequences. But this story brought up some familiar wounds. In Virginia, there was a case about a child killed by being cooked in a microwave. When those involved in the case saw the news, they decided to take a look back at the case of Paris Talley. They had never taken into consideration that this couple could have committed such a sickening act, as there had been no cases like this before. But there were similar patterns in both cases that raised serious concerns, and so detectives returned to the house that China and Terrell had left behind. Inside the house, they found the very microwave was still there and took DNA samples for tests. They did indeed find the DNA of Paris Talley inside the microwave, and worse than that, the structural pattern in the microwave directly matched the burns on the victim's skin. A shocking discovery, so horrific that China was arrested and charged with the aggravated murder of her own baby by cooking her alive. But what kind of psychopath would do such an unspeakable act? What led to this moment of murder by microwave? It seems Paris's mother and father are no strangers to breaking the law. Many people have reported that China was an alcoholic with a criminal record. She had several previous convictions, including forgery and abduction. Not only that, China's father was known as a drug dealer and also struggled with alcohol addiction, which often led to him becoming violent. Together, they led a life of drinking, arguing, and fighting. After their arrests, the true story of this most horrific of murders would come to light, and it's enough to make you sick to your stomach. That fatal night started when Terrell had heard rumors that China was cheating on him. They went to a local park where Terrell's intention was to get her drunk, hoping she would reveal the truth. The argument continued all the way home until Terrell left to sell drugs, and in a seemingly mindless act of evil, China took the innocent, tiny child and placed her in the microwave. It is reported that the child suffered for over 2.5 minutes inside that oven. A sad, heartbreaking end to a baby less than a month old. But justice did not come quickly, and there was a long legal road to face before this crime would be answered.
Some call China Arnold the microwave mom, but Michelle Wilkinson calls her something else.
That's my sister. She means so much to me. That's my sister. That's the family.
The first trial took place in early 2008, but in one of the many twists of this case, it was declared a mistrial. This was due to the fact that they had forced another family member to confess to the murder. But get this, that family member was the cousin of Paris and only 5 years old. Imagine trying to pin the vile murder of an innocent child onto another innocent child. It would appear this mother was even more deplorable than her crimes suggested. Luckily, several family members confirmed the 5-year-old was nowhere near the house at the time. It would be only a few months later that the second trial finally found her guilty. Her punishment? Life behind bars with no possibility of release, ever.
It took the jurors less than 7 hours to convict China Arnold of aggravated murder.
But in yet another twist, her appeal 2 years later led to the conviction of being overturned. Her defense in the Ohio court case managed on this grounds that witnesses were not allowed to defend the prosecuted party. Her lawyers have since attempted to get her another trial, but as she yet still serves time inside where she rightly belongs.
2 times this case has been before a jury. One jury came up with a mistrial. It just never seems to end. Is there ever going to be justice for baby Paris?
This has to be one of the worst cases of infanticide that has ever been reported. We may never know what was going through this woman's head as she placed her baby in a microwave and turned the power on. But we can rest easier knowing this sick child killer will be going nowhere near freedom anytime soon. The death of young Paris may have been a horrible and tragic act. But that compares nothing to the prolonged agony of our next victim, suffered at the hands of her own mother. If you thought this mother was just a one-off case, wait till you hear the horrors in the next one.
She was so skinny that she didn't have anything on her. She was just skinny, and she just looked worn out for a 15-year-old.
December 9th, 2009. The grandmother of Jeanette Maples receives a distressing call from her own daughter, Angela McAnultys. There was something very wrong with Jeanette, and Angela appeared to be very distressed. Eventually, 911 were called, and the first responders arrived quickly on the scene. What they found inside that house was heartbreaking. They found 15-year-old Jeanette unresponsive and in a terrible state. She was partially naked, had cuts and bruises all over her body, and her front teeth were broken right down to the gums. She was rushed to the hospital, where sadly, she was pronounced dead. It was here that the authorities noticed some other issues that would need to be explained. As well as the cuts and bruises and broken teeth, she weighed only 50 pounds and had wounds on her legs and back. A wound on her hip was worn right through to the bone. She was dehydrated and her lips were completely ravished. Her face was so damaged, she had become disfigured. The medical examiner's report stated that there were so many injuries on her body, with some infected, that they could not determine which injury killed her. Naturally, the police quickly became involved, and both Angela and Richard McAnultys were arrested on suspicion of abuse. But what police discovered about this girl's life was heartbreaking and tragic.
Something very dark was going on in that house.
Inside the house, they discovered what is described as a torture room. And in that room, there were leather belts and other devices intended to cause pain. Pieces of Jeanette's flesh were also found, and it was clear something unimaginable had been going on in that house for a very long time. But what could have brought about this sickening treatment of a young, innocent child?
Angela had a deep-seated need to dominate, control, and abuse.
Angela McAnultys had lost her mother at just 5 years old when she was tragically murdered. She started using drugs at a young age after becoming involved with a carnival worker. She had 3 children in the 1990s, 2 sons and a daughter, all of whom were taken away by child services. After obeying a court order, one of those children was returned to her, and that child was Jeanette Maples. It is reported that the judge refused the return of her 2 sons after they begged to stay in their foster homes. Perhaps this was the first sign of the horrors that were to come. Angela became involved with Richard in 2002, and later that year they were married. His job as a long-haul driver kept him away from home a lot until a heart attack in 2009. As well as Jeanette, the couple had 2 other children living in the house, both who seemed to lead normal, happy lives and show no signs of mistreatment like Jeanette. But it soon became apparent over time that there was something very wrong in the McAnultys household. When Jeanette was still in school, she was showing signs of malnourishment. She was often bruised and wore dirty clothing. However, her teacher noticed that she was withdrawn and just didn't look healthy at all. When she asked her about this, the teacher must have been horrified to learn that Jeanette's own mother was abusing her. In fact, over a 3-year period, she not only confided in her teacher, but also friends who confronted her in gym class about all the bruises they had spotted on her body. Yet again, she said the same thing. Even Jeanette's own grandmother, Lynn McAnultys, called the DHS to report what was going on under the roof of the House of Hell. With all these cries for help, the authorities had no choice but to take action.
She was given tiny bits of food to survive.
The faucets were locked up and the knobs were taken off the faucets, so she couldn't get water.
She would drink out of the dog's bowl or even out of the toilet.
Officials visited Jeanette's home, but in a cruel twist of fate, her mother convinced the DHS that her daughter was a compulsive liar.
If you tell anyone, I will know, and things will be even worse for you.
She was taken at her word, and the DHS left the house without further investigation, without even bothering to see what condition Jeanette was in with their own eyes. Although it's not really any comfort, the 2 officers who visited her were disciplined, and the policies were changed so that face-to-face meetings were conducted for cases just like this. But none of this would help save Jeanette from the fate that her mother had chosen for her. In order to throw suspicion away from what was going on, Angela decided it was time to take her daughter out of state education and homeschool her. With no teachers or friends to keep an eye on her, Jeanette's fate was in the hands of her psychopathic mother.
I like to think there's a special place in hell for Angela, but I don't think Satan wants her there.
Cut off from her friends and from the education system, Jeanette was confined to the house. Inside the torture room, she had to endure, day after day, beatings with leather belts, metal rulers, and sticks. This sickening treatment went on for years.
She whipped her so much that there was no skin or flesh left on her hips.
In order to mask the noises coming from the room, Angela would turn the vacuum cleaner on. Richard McAnultys later said he knew what was going on and yet did nothing. The other children must have known what was happening, and if they did, it must have been terrifying. Maybe they even wondered if they would be next. Jeanette's grandmother became seriously concerned and finally managed to gain access to the house, and she almost caught Angela in the act. Jeanette was facing a wall and looked in pretty bad shape. Her grandmother left the house and once again called the DHS to report what was happening. That was October 2009. This would be the last time she ever saw Jeanette alive. Sadly, before anyone intervened to stop this girl's torment, her body gave up and began to shut down. It was at this point Angela picked up the phone to ask for help. It took until December 16, 2009, until both parents were taken into custody and charged with aggravated murder.
Investigators could not believe that she was a 15-year-old because she was so small.
After Angela and Richard were arrested, Lynn McAnultys entered the house and was shocked at the mess left behind. Bloodstains, litter everywhere, the kinds of conditions no child should ever be made to live in. During interrogation, Angela tried to claim it was in fact Richard who gave out the discipline in the house in an attempt to divert from her own twisted actions. But not only did Richard tell a different story, the other children did too. In the end, both of these parents would face trial.
As for the stepfather, Richard McAnultys, he pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of murder by abuse and was sentenced to life in prison.
But the most severe and most deserved sentence was saved for Angela herself. After pleading guilty to one of the most sinister crimes against a child the world has ever seen, she was given the death penalty. But in a twist of fate almost a decade later, the sentence was reduced to life without the chance of parole, the maximum punishment for this crime. This was due to laws being changed around the death penalty and also because the state had not given any concessions for the original guilty plea. Even with her sentence reduced, we can at least rest a little easier knowing that those responsible will have plenty of time to think long and hard about their actions from inside a prison cell. But if you thought this was the worst it could get, wait for the next one. Kids can sometimes get in the way of things, and as a mother, you would come to expect this kind of disruption a lot. But kids should never feel like such a burden that you would want them out of the way permanently. But on January 15th, 2018, an emergency dispatcher receives a disturbing call from a young mother about her daughter.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
No.
They're not breathing?
No.
Okay. And who was it we're talking about?
Lexi, she's 3.
She's 3? Bear with
Yeah.
me. Okay. So she's unconscious and she's not breathing.
When the first responders arrived, they found young Lexi unresponsive, desperate to save her. They began CPR. But tragically, this 3-year-old girl would not survive and was pronounced dead the same night. You would expect this to be the most distressing time in any parent's life. But the behavior of Louise Porton in the aftermath of this heartbreaking moment was a little weird, to say the least. Just 17 days later, her other daughter, Scarlett, also lost her life, and investigators soon took notice. What they learned about Louise shocked the Birmingham Crown Court and the world. This case takes us over to the United Kingdom in Rugby, Bath. On the surface, Louise appeared to be like any other young mother of 2 children. Although she was a single mother, she seemed to be taking care of her children as you would expect. But under the surface, there was something extremely sinister about this woman, and her children were not as welcome in her life as she may have led them to believe. After the death of her second child, Scarlett, on February 1st the same year, and with some suspicious circumstances, Warwickshire police launched an investigation. Both girls had died from having their airways restricted, and their mother's explanation was not sitting well with the police. As the deaths had been unusual, it was policy for an investigation to start. Sometimes the investigation is simply procedure and often shows no wrongful doing. But what police discovered about Louise Porton led to an investigation into double murder and a shocking neglect of parental duties. It took until 2 days before Scarlett's death before Louise's phone was finally seized. This was due to the heartbreaking behavior she was showing at the funeral parlor Lexi's body was being held at. According to the staff member, she was laughing as she spoke to a man on FaceTime. Although it would be too late to save the youngest child, the evidence on her phone was crucial to the case and helped bring justice for these 2 innocent children. While her phone was seized, the true gruesome details of the life of this mother and the children came to light. Louise was a part-time model and obsessed with men. Weeks before her first child's death, while doctors were treating Lexi, her mother was in the hospital toilets taking topless pictures of herself and making arrangements to meet a man. After Lexi was discharged, Louise had been looking online for information, and what she searched for is chilling to say the least. Online searches that were found on her phone included, "Can you actually die if you have a blocked nose and cover your nose with tape?" and other searches about drowning and resuscitation. It was concluded by police that this hospital visit was actually a result of an attempted murder, and she was checking online to cover her tracks. The day after Lexi died, evidence was found that she had been on a dating app and added over 40 new friends. Hardly the actions of a grieving mother. But this odd and suspicious behavior was not limited to the death of Lexi, as both children's deaths just didn't add up. And CCTV evidence would help to prove this allegedly innocent mother was in fact harboring some deadly secrets. On the night that Scarlett was killed, she was filmed leaving a hotel they were staying in at Rugby, carrying Scarlett in her arms. As she pulled into a gas station to fill up her car, medical examiners had said that although Scarlett was in the car with her, she was already dead by this point. What kind of sick, evil person could drive their already deceased daughter around like nothing had happened? But that's not the worst part. Louise had actually been messaging men asking for money and saying how worried she was about her health. It seems this mother was more interested in sex than caring for her children, and they had gotten in her way one too many times. Her trial would reveal the true horrors these children were living with. Her landlady at the time of the murders testified that she had been looking after Louise's children more and more, as she was too busy doing social things. Over time, the landlady found herself spending more and more time looking after the children. Regarding the deaths themselves, the evidence pointed towards Louise calling emergency services after both children were dead, so she could make sure there was no chance of revival. A callous and cold way to treat any human being, let alone small, defenseless children. Although Louise had denied any wrongdoing throughout the trial, the simple fact that both children had died from having their airwaves restricted was enough for the jury to find her guilty of murder. Her children had gotten in the way of her sex life, and she did the unthinkable to solve her problem. The children's father, Chris Draper, who was never given the chance to get to know his own kids, was heartbroken. On these terrible crimes, he said, "Why did Louise do something so evil to our beautiful daughters? You are their mother, the person who is supposed to care for them, protect, and love them. They were just an inconvenience to you. How could you do this? I sit and think day and night, and I can't understand why my two little girls were taken away because Louise wanted to sleep around." When Louise's mother learned what her own daughter had done to her grandchildren, she struggled to cope and fell into a spiral of depression. It was eventually all too much, and she sadly took her own life in February 2020, aged just 48, another victim of Louise's despicable crimes. It is reported she showed no signs of remorse as she was sentenced to a minimum of 32 years in prison. Hardly justice for the two poor children and their father. But at least we know she will serve a long time behind bars before Louise Porton breathes free air ever again. Motherhood is supposed to be a time to nurture and protect those we love the most. A time to watch and cherish the years you see them grow, develop, and become adults themselves. These three mothers, however, didn't have that parental instinct, or they just didn't care enough if they did. The sick minds of these psychopathic mothers led all three to commit one of the ultimate sins, shocking authorities around the world. Let's hope what we learn from these three cases will help to prevent or at least help to spot signs of neglect and abuse earlier, and ensure that all cases like these are few and far between.